Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're exploring the one death pretty much everyone has heard of, yet almost no one has actually looked into using the raw original evidence. Okay, picture this. You're walking into a Victorian crime scene. Instantly, there's this visceral sense of dread. You're looking at a tightly localized scene of utter destruction, a physical impossibility that completely broke the investigative frameworks of the time. We're talking, of course, about spontaneous human combustion. Let's dive right in.
Our starting point is London, the Aldgate inquest of 1852. Coroners are standing in a room investigating the death of a man named John Belt. Now, according to the original deposition transcripts, which by the way are still sitting in the public record office, they found his body reduced entirely to calcinated ash. But here is the eerie, genuinely horrifying detail. The wooden chair right beneath him, it survived perfectly intact. There was no fire spread anywhere, there was absolutely no accelerant found. It was just a human being, completely and utterly incinerated from the inside out, while the rest of the room went totally untouched.
And this quote right here brilliantly captures just how baffled the scientific and legal communities of the era were. Surgeon Benjamin Richardson actually noted in an 1869 British Medical Journal review that this was the one category of death the Victorian coroner system simply couldn't process. Witnesses across totally different jurisdictions were reaching for the exact same language to describe what they saw: extreme localized heat capable of calcinating bone, yet confined entirely to a human body, leaving chairs, floors, and curtains mere inches away, perfectly unscorched.
That brings us to Section 1, the impossible crime scene. To truly grasp the dread of this mystery, we have to look at the historical boundaries. This isn't just some isolated Victorian ghost story. The documented records span centuries and entirely unconnected jurisdictions. I mean, it goes all the way back to a 1673 account by Danish physician Thomas Barthilin. It moves through that 1852 John Beltson inquest, the really infamous 1951 death of Mary Reeser down in Florida where the FBI actually got involved, and the 1982 case of Jeannie Saffin in London. And incredibly, as recently as 2010, after exhaustive investigations by modern forensic experts and fire services, a coroner in Galway, Ireland, officially ruled spontaneous human combustion as the cause of death for 76-year-old Michael Faraday.
What makes this truly terrifying is the horrific sensory evidence left behind at these scenes. If you look at the medical literature, like the massive review by Lester Adelson in the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology, these cases share some incredibly macabre hallmarks. Coroners didn't just find standard fireplace ashes. They documented a residuum of greasy, fitted ashes. They consistently reported an unctuous, stinking empyreumatic odor and this deeply penetrating soot. Historically, observers even noted lambent blue flames that seemed to literally recede back into the body as you approached it. It was a type of burning entirely distinct from your ordinary house fire. And to understand just how impossible this all is, we really need to understand human cremation. You see, the human body is notoriously difficult to burn. Adelson's paper cites historical executions to make this point. Take a baker's boy named Renard who was burned at the stake. It took 2 massive carts of wood and 10 full hours of burning, and you know what? His remains were still visible. Modern calculations show you need about 100 pounds of wood just to partially combust a human body. Yet in these weird, anomalous cases, victims burned to ash rapidly, thoroughly, and with virtually zero external fuel.
Moving on to Section 2, centuries of burning myths.
So, faced with crime scenes that defied everyday physics, society desperately tried to fill in the blanks. For a long time, the dominant theory was something called alcoholic impregnation. The basic idea was that heavy, chronic alcohol consumption literally saturated a person's tissues, turning them highly flammable. Charles Dickens actually popularized this in his novel Bleak House, where a character combusts. Dickens even defended the science of this in his prefaces. But yeah, science eventually completely debunked this. Medical examiners pointed out that even museum specimens, literally steeped in jars of alcohol, only burn on the surface. The solid interior tissues just fizzle out and burn incredibly slowly.
Because of that, the theories had to evolve. More recently, a researcher named Brian J. Ford proposed a biological ignition theory. He pointed out that when a human is unwell or on certain extreme diets, they enter ketosis, which builds up acetone in the fatty tissues. This acetone could potentially collect in a gaseous form right under a person's clothing. According to Ford's theory, the energy required to ignite these gaseous hydrocarbons is incredibly small. We're talking just 0.02 millijoules. A tiny, imperceptible static spark from synthetic clothing could, in theory, trigger a fierce combustion.
But, you know, often the supernatural myths just shatter when we apply rigorous forensic scrutiny. Take that 1982 case of Jeannie Saffin.
Paranormal advocates absolutely love this case. Her brother-in-law famously claimed she breathed roaring dragon fire out of her mouth, while her clothes miraculously remained unburned. It sounds crazy, right? Well, investigator Joe Nickel dug into the actual police and medical records. The actual facts? Her mouth was completely undamaged. Police officers arriving on the scene literally had to extinguish her burning nylon clothing. And the ignition source, a cross breeze from an open window, almost certainly blew lit embers from her father's pipe directly onto her highly flammable clothes. Neutral forensic facts usually dismantle the supernatural pretty quickly.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Wick effect model. Moving way beyond the myths, the forensic community eventually united behind one highly morbid but very logical explanation. The crucial concept here is the Wick effect. Formally published and detailed by forensic scientist John DeHaan in the 1984 Journal of Forensic Sciences, this model explains how a body can sustain a fire that destroys it entirely while leaving the room perfectly intact. The human body essentially acts as an inside-out candle.
Let's walk through exactly how this terrifying biological process works. Step 1. A modest external ignition source, maybe a dropped cigarette or a rogue ember, ignites the clothing and eventually burns through the skin. Step 2. That intense localized heat begins to melt the subcutaneous human fat. And remember, human fat has long hydrocarbon chains that pack a massive amount of energy. Step 3. This liquid fat slowly seeps into the clothing or maybe the carpet or upholstery, turning it into a carbonaceous wick. And finally, Step 4. This combination sustains a very slow, very intense, and highly localized fire that basically feeds on the body itself, without ever needing to spread outwards.
And the crazy thing is, this wasn't just some abstract theory. It was actually tested. In 1998, the BBC television program QED conducted a macabre but super fascinating experiment. They wrapped a dead pig, chosen specifically for its similar fat content to humans, in a blanket inside a fully furnished room and ignited it with just a small splash of petrol. The result? The body burned for hours with a low, very intense flame. It successfully destroyed flesh and bone. The heat pooled all the way up at the ceiling, actually melting a television set, but the flames themselves caused almost zero damage to the surrounding furniture right next to it. The Wick effect was literally validated on camera. But you might be wondering, why does the body turn completely to ash in these specific historical cases? Well, a thesis by Angie M. Christensen at the University of Tennessee provided the missing biological link. If you look at the victimology of these cases, they are overwhelmingly elderly females. This demographic generally has a much higher ratio of body fat, providing more fuel. But more importantly, they often suffer from osteoporosis. Christensen's experiments proved that osteoporotic, less dense bone incinerates significantly faster and far more thoroughly than healthy bone. In fact, crematorium workers have long known this for a fact. Elderly bodies with higher fat content just burn hotter and faster.
So by the late 1990s and early 2000s, this was basically considered a closed case. Forensic pathologists universally accepted the Wick effect. Between highly flammable synthetic clothing, the melting subcutaneous fat, the carbonaceous Wick effect, and the porous bones of the elderly, science had officially extinguished the mystery of spontaneous human combustion once and for all. It was just a grim, slow-burning biological candle. End of story, right?
Well, let's look at Section 4. The physics say impossible. Just as the forensic biologists were packing up their files and calling it a day, the physicists walked into the room, took one look at the historical data, and totally pulled the rug out from under the consensus. Here is the lingering, massive question. Biology perfectly explains the fuel source and the long burn, but does the strict thermodynamic physics of the actual ignition add up? Simulating a fire with a splash of petrol in a controlled, modern laboratory is one thing, but a body organically igniting in a Victorian living room from a dropped match and reaching those extreme temperatures, that is entirely another.
To put this into perspective, we have to look at the raw energy requirements. According to data cited in the Almanac of Physics, the energy required to fully combust a human body and totally calcinate bone is approximately 10 to the 9th joules. That is 1 billion joules. That is an absolutely staggering, massive amount of energy. Generating that kind of instant destructive force requires extreme circumstances, certainly not just a smoldering piece of cotton fabric. This brings us to a really quiet but completely groundbreaking peer-reviewed study published in 2008 by thermodynamics researchers at the University of Sheffield. They didn't even look at the biology. They looked strictly at the math of the char patterns left behind in these historical cases. And what they found? It blew the cold case files wide open again. The Sheffield researchers painstakingly analyzed the calcination depth of the bones and the extreme spatial confinement of the fires documented by those Victorian coroners. Their findings were genuinely shocking.
To replicate those exact char patterns in that tightly confined space, massive initial ignition temperatures were absolutely required. The physics strictly dictate that a dropped pipe ember, a tiny static spark, or literally any accidental domestic source in the historical record is mathematically incapable of generating the initial heat necessary to trigger the level of instant, localized destruction seen by those coroners.
Which leaves us with this chilling friction. As one analysis perfectly sums it up, the science has an official answer, the physics has a footnote that doesn't quite go away. You literally have two branches of science in a total standoff here. You have the coroners and biologists who have conclusively proven how the body burns once it's ignited. But then you have the physicists who have mathematically proven that the temperatures required to start and sustain that highly specific pattern of burn are virtually impossible in a domestic setting.
So biology closed the case, but physics reopened it. We are left with the raw case files sitting quietly in the public record office, detailing bodies turned to absolute ash while the wooden chair beneath them stands perfectly untouched. What is really happening in the space between the biological fuel and the impossible physical ignition? As you walk away from this explainer today, I want you to ask yourself, in a world governed by strict scientific laws, how do we explain the fire that burns from within, completely defying the very physics that should put it out? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.